in Providence, Rhode Island. And Bill?
Greetings from Portland, and Evgeny's already said a couple of words about us, so just wanted to say how honored I was, and I think I can speak for Lynn as well, that we were to receive the opportunity to talk today about a topic that we thought a whole lot about, particularly in working on the textbook Между нами.
Okay, so a few logistics. As Evgeny has already said, feel free to write in questions at any time using the Q&A function. We will take 2 pauses during the course of the presentation to answer questions and allow for time to submit additional questions. Our preference would be to have you use the Q&A function. And I'll say a sentence in Russian. Презентация будет проводиться на английском языке, но хотим заранее сказать, что вопросы можно задать или на английском, или на русском. Отвечать мы будем, соответственно, на том языке.
And so to start out with, we'd like to point your attention to the 3 elements that are in our title that we're trying to balance: input, vocabulary, and grammar. And we recognize that grammar teaching and learning is always with us. So the question is, how do we manage it when we teach with limited time that learners have in a classroom? How can we make these 3 elements work together and effectively? Our contention is going to be that they can be part of a single process that leads to successful student learning, and that we understand all 3 of these components are worked on in different types of communication, right? So we can have input, vocabulary work, grammar work, that's in reading, it's in listening, it's in speaking, and it's in writing. So these are really elements that cut across those types of communication.
Both the elements in the title, input, vocabulary, and grammar, and the types of communication that we're talking about, reading, listening, speaking, writing, are listed in a specific order for reasons that we'll be talking about. Our game plan today is to present some initial discussion of input, and then to present a sample cycle of materials drawn from a first-year Russian course in which the grammatical topic is conjugation of verbs that are being introduced for the first time. Our plan happens today to focus on first-year work, but these principles can be applied at higher levels with different kinds of input. We will also share in the handout both checklists of the procedures to create materials like this and links to examples of these kinds of materials that deal with other grammar points.
And I'm still getting the hang of the technology, and therefore I went on to slide 2 while Lynn was still speaking. So I hope to get my actions coordinated. But to start out with then is a discussion of input, and that's probably about our first 10 or 11 slides. And it's good to start out by thinking about what we mean by input and what kind of role it plays in language learning. And for us, we're going to use the definition that you see on the screen. So input is language that learners encounter and whose meaning, that is communicative content and intent, they try to comprehend. And to think about how we can make sure that learners have opportunities to comprehend the input and to show that comprehension. The definition is really quite broad, and we did that intentionally because there really are an enormous number of kinds of input and types of input available to them. And then the final point is to start thinking about designing activities where learners can use elements of input for communication in a supported way before beginning to produce language on their own.
Okay, so we can go on to slide 3. So for us, an important starting point is and has been considering the specifics of the kind of input we're using and for what purposes we're using it. So it's worth taking just a few minutes to be clear about what we mean when we say input in terms of what the input actually looks like. We're going to discuss the interplay between input and work on grammar on language forms, and we're going to take, as we said, that fairly concrete and universal topic of introducing verb conjugation. But let's take that step back and think about the kinds of input we have. We tend to talk about two kinds. First, authentic material produced by the target language community for consumption by those in the target culture. And this can come, as we know, in a variety of media, print, graphic, audio, or video. And just let's quickly look at some examples. So here we have a screenshot of an actual Chajna Ложка menu. What do we want to notice about it right now? It conveys information. It models a particular grammatical construction as well, at least this particular screenshot does. It's really great for comprehension of a certain kind, but it is problematic as a model for student production of these specific forms, largely because of the vocabulary that happens to occur in it. So, в сливочном соусе may not be where you want to go necessarily. С курой в сливочном соусе, с рубленым мясом may not be what you want to have as your first encounter with the с чем instrumental case construction. С ветчиной и сыром is maybe a little closer to what they need, but it's a target culture, it's an authentic source of input. It's hard to control that in the form in which it occurs, as we might say, in nature. And if we go on to the next slide, we can see another example, and that tells us something too. We have a weather report, again, great for comprehension, listening, recording info, but the language that the journalist uses will not really model the conversational student production that we might want to get a first-year student to by the end of working on prognoz pogody or anything connected with the weather as a phenomenon. Okay, next, we have a fairy tale. So this fairy tale, like all literary texts, the language in it will not coincide with the language students need either to talk about the text or to use in conversational interaction generally. And that is, it doesn't make literary texts less desirable to read, but it does mean we have to think about that aspect of it as we organize our language input with an eye towards working on grammar eventually. And next, this is an authentic email. It happens to be one that was sent to me. But it, I think, encapsulates some of the issues around authentic communication of the sort. It does model some features of desirable student language production. Привет, всего доброго. You know, it's set up as an email. You can see it. But it's situated in a context of communication that is not immediately clear to the learner. Why is he writing me? What is this about? It does, and this is a plus, it does give input above the level of a single sentence, which is something that we do desire and something that we need to bear in mind as we turn our attention to other kinds of input. So to sum up, authentic texts can be problematic precisely because we can't expect the learner to use exactly the language of the text, even though that they can demonstrate they've understood the text, the content of the text. So we're thinking about the goals and outcomes we have for learners and designing backwards from those goals to get to the input that will enable us to bring eventually that production about. And Bill is going to move on to talk about semi-authentic input.
Well, that's certainly the other kind of input that's typical, particularly for foreign language textbooks at the beginning and the intermediate levels. And by semi-authentic texts, we mean things that have been authored or created in the language. They represent likely speech that native speakers might exchange or use in a particular communicative situation, but it isn't something that's been captured out in the wild, so to speak. And semi-authentic tends to describe much of what's in textbooks, particularly at the beginning level, and it really can include a range of texts, such as illustrated presentation of new vocabulary, dialogues, monologic texts, like authored emails or tweets written for a textbook. And To show an example that we used in the Mirzunami textbook, here's a vocabulary list that does come and tries to go back and teach the students different food words in Russian. It mirrors the menu that you saw just a few slides ago. But why use the semi-authentic version of this in a first-year textbook over the authentic one? And for us, the answer was that the semi-authentic text can help learners, particularly at the beginning level, by managing some of the vocabulary load that they will encounter in an authentic text. Semi-authentic text may provide a better model for learners in shaping their own language production. This is not to say that it's bad to have authentic texts. Authentic texts are really very important, particularly in comprehension mode, right? Interpretive mode. But as models of production and as models for fine-tuned grammar work, getting grammatical form out of the input, they can be problematic. And to go on to a very typical item or component of most of our teaching materials at the first and second year level are these semi-authentic dialogues that serve as input. And input is in virtually all of our beginning first and second year textbooks. We chose two examples here of dialogues, one from Galasa and one from Beginner's Russian, because it is important to recognize that input is everywhere, and semi-authentic dialogues like this can be appropriate because the language can be really tailored to beginners. It's really possible for the beginners to make sense out of them. They contain a balance of new language with previous learned material, and students really can attend to their content or the meaning of the message, and that can be entirely understood. And they also serve, as we've said before, as a model for what a student might produce or enact. So to continue, when we were writing activities that used semi-authentic input, we were very conscious of thinking about some aspects of the input that we really wanted to keep in balance. There were some questions that we were asking ourselves about what types of communications we wanted learners just to understand versus what kinds we wanted them to produce. And our answers to those two questions helped us pick and create language input. And as we were selecting the input, we also thought about the amount of input that language learners would encounter and how comprehensible it would be. Particularly fine-tuned input that we wanted learners to really attend both to meaning and to form, it was important to actually peg that at that level of I+1, to use Krashen's formulation. And we often had to rethink as we were putting together materials to avoid that input that was at I+5. We were also thinking about how to represent certain grammatical forms in the input, how to make sure that they were obvious, that they were present in the language that we were working with or wanted to present to the students. And then we really wanted to consider how to align the input to the goals for learner production, for the learner output that would come at the end of our instructional sequence. And I know those questions and our answers to those questions can sound a little abstract at the moment. And I would ask you to bear with us because those considerations were really important in our thinking about how we designed the activities that we're going to show you in the second part of this webinar.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that takes us to the question of how do we articulate what our goals and outcomes are? And I think everywhere in the academy, we run up against this four-letter word spelled K-N-O-W. And we often say the students need to know. They need to learn this, they need to know this. And we tried very hard to identify goals in two different kinds of ways. First, we thought very hard about, as Bill said, the difference between comprehending a set of, between comprehending a quantity of material and being able to produce something, and bearing in mind always that comprehension and production are not going to overlap completely. There is very likely and almost certainly going to be a bigger range of language comprehended than there will be of language produced by the learner. In any case, when you're articulating your goals and outcomes, the question that we always asked ourselves, and we started asking it the day we started writing the table of contents, and I need to point out here that at this point, it is not just Bill and I doing this. I want to acknowledge Alice Muslova, who was in this project from the beginning, and we were all wrestling with this idea. What can the learner do with the language learned from the input? And this use of a can-do statement, which we'll demonstrate an example of later, was really our guiding principle. What can they comprehend? What can they produce? And the question of what explicit grammatical information they know, we separated. So it's important as an instructor to have the sense of what learners can do. What is the can-do statement? Not just what do they know by the end of the instructional sequence. And to share those goals and those outcomes, not just with your teaching staff, but with the students as well, so that they know what they are expected to be able to do. We're going to pause at this point to ask if you have questions, and then we are going to move on to talking about specific examples and taking you through the cycles of instruction. So let's just take a pause here, and if you have questions, you can write them in, and we will devote a few minutes to being able to answer them. If there are not questions, we will go on, but let's see if, give you a little time to ask questions if you have them. So I'm looking in Q&A, and I don't see questions at the moment. Yevgeny, is there another place that we would look for them? Are there? I want to make sure
in chat, but I also don't see any questions in chat.
Okay.
Okay, well, let's go on then.
There's one.
Okay.
Well, I think it's one of those things where we know it when we see it sometimes, and then sometimes we don't. Bill is probably better equipped to answer this, so I'm going to turn it over to him.
Once again, I think it depends on the nature of that authentic text, and then it also will depend on the nature of the tasks for that authentic text. Particularly when you want a lot of fine, detailed work and...
Oh, sorry, Bill, we need to repeat the question. The question
okay. The question is
there a percentage of new words beyond which an authentic text is unusable? And go ahead and repeat your answer.
So I would say in working with an authentic text, the question's going to be, what's the density of that text? Is it something like the menu from Chayная ложка, or is it something like a short story? And what is the nature of the tasks that you're creating for it will also give you some kind of sense as to whether it's how usable that text is. I would say if it's something that is relatively dense, that's mostly prose, You know, there are experts in reading pedagogy for English as a second language where they are suggesting, you know, no more than 5% of the words on a page should be unknown. Once again, I don't have strong feelings about that, but there is a literature out there about that topic.
Mm-hmm. And I would agree that it does depend on what you're going to do with the text, but if it's a text that's targeted towards eventual production by the learner, then you would not want to have a large portion of the text consist of new vocabulary, because then it would not meet that purpose. A question has just appeared. When telling students about the goals of an activity, do you speak English in class or ask students to read about them in English at home? We post the goals for the instructional unit. It happens to be a textbook unit, but we post them. They're on the website of the book. The students are given a checklist before tests to see, you know, have you learned to do these things?
That list of goals is written in English.
It's English, yes, in English.
The instructions for particular exercises or activities done in class tend to be in English, but with the idea that the instructor will actually speak about what needs to be done, mostly in Russian, and then the students are reading the English as essentially a kind of a gloss or subtitles for the instructor. And
that varies with the complexity of the activity, of course, but particularly once they've done a type of activity once, we can give them instructions, often in Russian, and we try to segue in the direction of giving them more instructions during the year, gradually in Russian. But the goals of an activity are clearly written in English above the activity before they begin, and we go over them. Okay, I think are there other questions? Yes. Okay, thank you. Yes, and the can-do statements, I agree with you, do lead to better student production and more student success. I think that's true. So thank you for your comment. Semi-authentic text could be, this is a new question, semi-authentic text could be unidiomatic. It is grammatically correct but rarely used, like salted tomatoes. You need to know kvashenaya kapusta more frequently. In this case, the list from Chaynaya Loshka could be more useful. Isn't it better to combine both sources? Okay. Bill, do you want to start?
I would certainly say that one can combine sources. You just have to come back to that question of where is my I+1, right? What do I want learners focused on right at the moment? Certainly semi-authentic texts, right? They might not be completely idiomatic, although one does try and one has materials read by a lot of people. Sometimes in a semi-authentic text, particularly as we're going to show for activities for having people notice form in grammar, you may want to actually visually help the learners see form that might be a little unusual for the way something might be formatted on a page normally. So I think there is some room to actually think about ways where we break convention to help people see something. Yeah. And then we get them back to convention after they've seen it, after they've been able to actually perceive it in the input.
And I would add that it's perfectly permissible, and I think good to include both semi-authentic and authentic texts for students to interact with, but they may have different purposes. The semi-authentic Chaynaya Loshka menu may be the thing they use to choose things, to check things from the menu that they want to eat, recognizing certain key vocabulary that they can do, or they may have an internet sort of an experiential learning exploratory activity to go out and find the things that they can eat because of whatever dietary restrictions or likes, dislikes they have, where they're working on it in that way. And what you do when they first encounter the something shim construction might be the semi-authentic text with the sequence of the kind of activities we're going to show you. I think both of those can exist profitably in the language classroom and around the language classroom in assignments as well. Okay.
We don't seem to have any more questions, so let's go on, and there'll be more opportunities to ask them, and you can certainly type them into the Q&A box as we're going along, and then we'll get to them in our next question break. So to come back to that statement about goals, and to start to pivot towards that sample cycle of materials for first-year Russian in teaching verb conjugation. So we're going to use materials from Между нами, the online textbook that we've co-authored with Alla Smyslova and Jonathan Perkins. And while we're drawing material from one particular book, it's important to note that the techniques that we're describing can really be used with any language input in other textbooks, and can also be used with authentic input, particularly at the higher levels, once one gets beyond the very beginning of language learning. So to go on to the next slide, right, what learners will be able to do.
Yep. So now we're going to start thinking about the actual instructional sequence. How do we lay it out? But to do that, we really need to know how we think about the can-do statements and how do we think about knowing. And we're going to take verb conjugation as our example, and we're going to think about that. And we want to think about the balance to establish between or among the three elements in our title: input, vocabulary, and grammar. And we keep coming back to that because we really see these things interacting all the time. So for example, when learners first encounter present tense verbs, the instructor might identify these types of outcomes. Notice that these outcomes that you can see on your screen are phrased as can-do statements. Ask and tell about these activities. Do you work? What are you doing? Are you relaxing? Oh, you're taking a stroll. Oh, are you reading? Oh, you're reading. What are you reading? Things that you and others are doing now or do regularly. And those are can-do statements that let the teacher and the student know what will the learner be able to use the new forms to accomplish in communication. Along with that, on the right-hand side, we can identify a quantity of information about language, what we conventionally call grammar explanations, that we will want our students to read and take in as information and understand as information. And we often talk about, this is where we deploy that word know. We talk about knowing these things. For us, it's important to distinguish the knowing that from the knowing how, the can-do of the communicative outcomes, because they really are separate things in certain kinds of ways. Okay. So this takes us on to another possible set of outcomes connected with verbs. Ask and tell about what you and others read and listen to, and compare that to, for example, Russian reading and listening habits. So this immediately runs us into the fact that grammatical topics don't occur in isolation. Yes, there is verb conjugation, but eventually we are going to have to require learners to work on other grammatical issues closely related to verb conjugation. We need those verb complements. We need the дополнение eventually. But we've separated the two ideas, both in the can-do statements and in the knowing the knowing of the structures, and you can show that, Bill, on the right. So what is it that they need to know in order to be, will they need to read about? The fact that verbs have different complements, direct objects, adverbs, locational expressions with the prepositional. They will need to know that nouns and adjectives change their endings. both for direct objects in the accusative and for where expressions, location expressions in the prepositional. So these are all things that are going to follow on from the fact that we have presented and students have worked on verbs. And as we think about going from the process of input to output, we think about what accomplishes the goals and how we can build the structures that enable us to build a bridge from that input that they're going to see, which we'll show you in a minute, to the moment when they start not using it independently yet, but producing the language, working to understand the language. So that is our next step. And I'm going to turn it back over to Bill here to talk about how that process begins and what the input is going to consist of.
Well, that became the question for us in teaching those beginning verb conjugations. So we had set the goal of what kinds of verbs. Then we asked ourselves the question, what kind of input could we have that would help learners see those forms in context, be able to comprehend them, and then be able to start using forms from there in communication. And so what we were thinking about were caption pictures, kind of micro dialogues, and then maybe some monologic text, some kind of letter or email. All of these are kinds of texts where the input has some kind of meaning to it, right? There's some kind of message conveyed by the input. And that's an important notion to have, that input is connected with message, with some kind of text meaning, as well as these targeted language forms. For us, what separates input from, say, a bilingual vocabulary list of verb infinitives with English definitions next to them is that there really isn't a message for learners to focus on in a bilingual vocabulary list. So what we actually came up with for the input for the first introduction of verbs, and what you see on the screen now is about 2/3 of the web page that has pictures, small captions, and an audio file to go with it. So what helps the learners make sense out of the input on this page? Well, one are the graphics, clearly. They help the learner distinguish, what is a читает from what is an отдыхает, from what is a слушает, what is a гуляет, what's играет. And so those are important ways of helping that kind of lexical information, those words get connected with meaning. There is also glossed vocabulary on the website, so learners can cursor over new words and see an English gloss to them. The input's also contextual in the sense that these are 5 characters. The little drawings represent 5 characters whom they've seen before and whom they are getting to know additional information about. So that there is a kind of world of information that starts to form around these characters, and that we can exploit their knowledge of who these people, in quotation marks, are in checking their understanding of the input. So we've spoken about the visual support. We also want to take a look at the volume of input. It was important for us to think about not just a single occurrence of one of these words, of a picture like this, and Amanda читает журнал, period, no more, because we wanted to have a richer set of input, kind of more material for them to read, to comprehend, to think about, that would serve as a basis for richer output. We have tried and are also very cognizant of the idea that input should be compelling, right? There should be some reason to want to pay attention to the meaning of the input. It's very hard to do that when you're working in a textbook environment, but we hope that the story that the students learn about these characters will at least motivate them to continue to pay attention to the content, to the message of the input that they encounter in the textbook. And so now we're going to look at some additional examples in the sequence, and to say a couple of more things about the nature of this input.
Okay.
Move 2 slides. So even in this first 2/3 of the page, there's a volume of input. There are 15 occurrences of present tense, third person singular verbs, of 9 distinct verbs in this little mini universe of factual information about the people pictured. Although we've used a set of people who appear in our kind of soap opera, really any set of pictures that would be identifiable, that would have people having certain characteristics, could work to start connecting the written input and audio input of the recording together with what the meanings of those verbs are, to start that lexical work with students. We did make a choice in this first encounter that learners have with the input that features verb conjugation to stick with third-person singular verbs only. And you might ask why. Our first thought was it's important for learners to see a wide variety of morphology even within one conjugation. And we thought that it made sense to actually introduce more verbs with one form than to have multiple forms all at once of many verbs, or to have all of the forms of just a single verb. Having the more lexical items with a narrower range of grammatical form allows us to do a lot more communicative work with that set of verbs than perhaps presenting all the persons at once. It also, starting with the third person, means that there is a kind of an objective reality in this input that we can check learners' comprehension with. So we can take these pictures and recycle them with different kinds of captions to see whether the students have actually figured out that отдыхает goes much better with someone sitting in an armchair than with somebody kicking a soccer ball.
Ну, он тоже отдыхает. That's your prejudice about soccer. But are we going on? Okay.
Yes.
So that takes us now to the question of the process. What do we start to think about having people do with the input? So what is the learner's interaction with the input? And rather than just say, go home and read this, go home and listen to it, we're going to try and guide that process so that we start taking learners from this place of encountering the input to understanding it. And the question that we ask is, what is the first thing that we want you, the learner, to notice about these brand new words? The grammatical ending, or what the content of the sentence actually is? And we as instructors ask ourselves, can one work on both those things at exactly the same time? We're going to suggest that it is profitable and useful to separate them and work on those two things, noticing and understanding the meaning of the communication, and then noticing and working on the nature of the forms themselves, and working on them stepwise. With lexical meaning work, a lot of it preceding work on the verb forms as forms. So what do we mean when we say process for meaning, start with meaning? Process input for meaning means that learners work particularly on verbs as lexical items. Global comprehension. What is Amanda doing? She's reading and writing, but not walking in the park. And the second, vocabulary. There needs to be no question in any of the learners that if you encounter пишет in the input, you are imagining fingers on a keyboard, fingers on a phone screen, or holding some kind of writing instrument. And chitayet, you are not doing that necessarily in the, well, you may in fact be doing both at the same time, but if you are saying Amanda pishet, you are not confusing that with Amanda chitayet. And if you see and encounter Caitlin gulyayet, or anyone else gulyayet, you are not imagining Amanda sitting at her desk. So that's how we start. And we can go on to the next slide. I would say there's almost what you might describe as a barrage of comprehension activities. So this is the second activity that they do in class. They do a matching activity. They've already been shown a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation about the verbs. They've already seen the online textbook and heard the online textbook presentation. They've already done an initial meaning check where they're just marking the English meanings of the verb phrases that they've seen. And you notice they're still seeing those third-person forms even in English. And here that we are asking them to identify which character is doing each action by writing in the corresponding letter in the blank. And you can see that there's a lot more characters here than we've shown you. That's because you've only seen about 2/3 of that verb page. There are all of the hosts and administrators that the students interact with. Hence, there is a Zoya Stepanovna and a Marata Zatovich, etc. And they are doing these things. But notice at the bottom, you can see that there is letter K. On the right-hand side, there is this choice nikto. So we actually put some red herrings in. And, you know, as it happens, yes, one person is playing chess. No one happens to be writing a composition. No, there's one thing that no one is doing, at least. So they really do have to pay attention to the content, and they have to think about really what the people are doing. Okay. They also do comprehension work at home, and they do a lot of it. After every text, they have a set of activities called Вы всё поняли, where they have to go in and do various kinds of comprehension activities that are vocabulary oriented and often contain audio. And this often happens the day they encounter the text, the first presentation of the information. Might be the second day after, but usually it's around the same time. And they're learning the vocabulary with written input and with audio input. I don't know if you can see, but on the left-hand side of the presentation, Bill, could you just wave the cursor at it? Yeah, there's a little arrow. And that arrow is an audio file. And so the learners have to listen to the audio, which is a question, and they have to choose the visual that goes with it. And they have several of these types of activities. We'll look at another one now. They get written input as well. Which sentence correctly captions the picture? Well, here it really has to be "Она играет рок," not "Она слушает рок." In the next one, you can see that they get a question again. It's another audio activity. They have to imagine that they are the person doing that activity, and they get the question, and the question might be, as you can see of the two answer choices, one is "Да, я читаю журнал," and the other is "Нет, я читаю журнал." Well, the question might be "Ты читаешь журнал?" or it might be "Ты гуляешь?" And if the question is "Ты гуляешь," the correct answer is "Б." I don't remember exactly what this particular number of the exercise has as its question, but let's assume that the question is "Ты гуляешь?" B is the only possible correct answer. Okay. So one can never do enough vocabulary learning work, especially if it's, as here, embedded in sentence-level contexts where the lexical meaning of the words to be learned is clearly understood. And notice at this point that the learner has been given the ya forms of the verbs with an audio file that's asking a question using the ty form. Ты пишешь сочинение? Нет, я читаю журнал. Or ты гуляешь? Нет, я читаю журнал. The image tells the student what the person is actually doing. So students have to show they understand the question, understand the meaning in the written input, and they have to choose the correct response. So this is part of the first encounter. Okay, now we can go on and show you the full page of the input that they see.
Right, so this is the full page, and there's not a lot more to say about it other than that there are some additional characters so that you can see the kind of range of lexical information, fully formed sentences that have both these verbs that they're learning how to conjugate and various kinds of complements for those verbs. And following the listening activities and reading activities that they've done online, they come into class and do some more comprehension work, once again pivoting from remembering those pictures to this activity where they have 9 sentences in the first person singular. And there's the list of characters here, and they really have to think about who was doing what on that afternoon and write in the most likely character next to the activities that were going on. So it focuses on meaning because there is a referential meaning here. There's definitely one correct answer where, according to the factual information of this mini universe, we have some definite answers here. There's also a pivot going on between the first person, the third person singular forms that they saw in the input and setting them up to start working on first person forms, which they see here in the input, which they see here in the input in fully formed sentences. This activity, although there is a new grammar element to it, is really completable by understanding the content of the storyline. It is not grammatically dependent, although it previews a grammar form that they're going to start working on next. And the instructor can take care to help students actually see that form in these sentences.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And as we start to pivot to the activities where students are no longer just comprehending input, but are starting to take that input that was comprehended and use it to work on form, we just have a short checklist here, right? So we've made sure that the learners understand the global content. We're sure that they know the vocabulary well, and now's the moment to pivot to start working on forms, right? To help learners focus on new forms, to have them understand exactly what's being signaled in something like chitayu versus chitayet, have them understand them, and then have them begin to use them in communicative activities. So let's see. Is this me?
Yeah.
Okay. So now that the students have done that kind of work, they've moved over to this first activity that's organized according to the principles of structured input. So you see that the students here have 8 sentences. They're in the ya form. And now they're actually reading these sentences to pick out something related to themselves, right? So we've moved from the mini universe of the storyline to start to personalizing this, where they're actually given well-formed input with verbs and these complements, and now they're actually comprehending it and personalizing it by picking a right adverb, either часто or редко, or if they don't do this activity at all, then the ya, nie option over in the third column. Students do this activity, they do this activity individually. It can be done with the instructor if the instructor is concerned that students get a little bit more rehearsal time actually pronouncing aloud the first person singulars. The instructor could say, read those 8 items, я читаю блоги, have the students repeat them, and at the end of that repetition, have the student actually select which option is true for him or her. This is pre-communicative work, right? It gets the students to focus on these forms. It gets the students to hear them and read them aloud to themselves, and to make a choice about them. And then in the next activity, they're actually going to exchange this information with other people. So in the next activity, we've now set up a checklist here for their partner. They're going to work in pairs now, and they're going to record their partner's name, and the partner's going to share their answers from those 8 questions, from those 8 statements in part 1, and the partner's going to record them. And you'll notice here we've set them up as the third person singular forms, and as they listen to their partner, they have this moment of accountability where they need to actually put a check in one of these boxes. That's an important concept in working with structured input, that when learners share information between each other, among themselves or in pairs, that there's some kind of accountability, that there's some kind of reason that B has to listen to A. And mostly that's accountability is carried out through some kind of checklist or some kind of decision making that needs to be done after the activity. These kinds of check boxes are also extremely useful for the teacher, because the teacher can walk around the room and just visually inspecting the student's page, get a sense of how far they are through an activity and if they're actually running into problems. So this activity relies on them using those first-person singular forms, recognizing these third-person singular forms. We've balanced form and meaning in both of these. We've provided the scaffolding where the student pairs are really unlikely to make mistakes in grammar. They may make mistakes in reading aloud what's on their paper, but they're unlikely to make mistakes in grammar because the scaffolding is in place. And they can pay attention to meaning as they're recording information in the table. Russian does have a lot of morphology, and all of that morphology does need to be learned, right? We're not trying to deny that, but we're trying to work on it step by step so that students have a lot of time with each individual form before they try to put together the whole paradigm. And another activity, right? So after the third-person activity, we saw there's a moment when they're supposed to compare all of their answers and make sentences where there is a plurality of people who do the same thing, and they're providing subjects for forms like читают блоги, right? So they're sharing information that they've gathered, they're connecting it up with a third-person plural form. The activity after that then asks them to start working on the мы form, to think of a close friend or relative, to write that name in the box, and then to take a survey here of what they do with that close friend. Sorry, my trackpad is too sensitive. And so the sentences are similar to the ones that they've seen in the first 2 exchanges of information, but you'll notice here the first one is мы читаем газеты, мы читаем поэзию, мы слушаем русские песни. So we're expanding slowly so that the meaning can't get lost here, right? They can't do this activity completely by rote. They should actually think about the words that are written on the page as they see the мы forms here. So by the end of this cycle of, I believe it's 6 activities, the learners will have actually seen, encountered, understood, and used 40 sentence-level examples containing conjugated verbs, and often with some kind of дополнение, with a direct object or with some kind of other phrase. So this gives them that quantity, that encounter with enough quantity of input that we can ask them to do some grammatical noticing before we move over to actually having them do output where they're much less guided and there's much less scaffolding.
Okay, so now we get to a slide that actually has the word grammar work at the title. And if you were thinking that's where we're going to start, we're here. But after they've encountered, as Bill said, and every student has had to read and encounter the 40 sentences. And we know that they've done it because we've built the accountability into the process, so we know they've all been working on them. If they've been in class, they've been doing it. So after encountering this much structured input in the language and using it to communicate personalized content, they're ready to have what we like to call the noticing moment, when they can look back over the structured input that they've seen and notice the particular grammatical feature that we want them to see, and that, of course, is the endings. And here is an example of, this is a matching activity. It could be writing forms that you see into a table. In other words, they're sort of co-constructing their grammatical help here. And I think it can give a certain type of learner particularly a sense of agency about it. They've found it, they've seen it, they've identified the fact that ya goes with the u or you ending. They've seen and identified the fact that the goes with the yesh ending. In this particular case, yesh, all the verbs they've seen happen to have been of that type. So they can construct what goes with the subject pronoun. Obviously, this is not the only picture they get of the grammatical system, and now we get to the grammar explanation. When they go online to the website, there is a category on the left-hand side of the menu. Instead of calling it grammatika, we call it a little bit about language, немного о языке, because it's not strictly only morphological information that's there, although a lot of it is. And this is where they go to read about verbs. And I'm going to concentrate primarily on the second one that you're seeing because it has the particular forms that they encountered in the input. And as you can see, it has the little arrow for each form. So they can listen to я читаю as well as read it. Ты читаешь. And all of those forms are read. Not every single verb is here, but multiple verbs are represented on that page. And the handout you'll get at the end will give you links to all of this so you can go and look at them. The other thing you can notice if you look at я читаю is you can see the information that's explaining why it is spelled you, whereas пишу is spelled у. So we use verb stems. We don't give students infinitives right off the bat, although obviously in our dictionary we use as the словарная форма the infinitive. But we felt that the stem forms were going to be helpful to students as they worked on learning conjugations, guiding them towards the correct ways of identifying what the verb endings are going to be. The other thing to notice is that they get lots and lots of examples. They've had tons of examples in the structured input, and they also, as you can see, get a lot of examples in the grammar explanations with audio support. We anticipated that one of the questions we were going to get asked is, do you do this in class or outside of class? When do you do this? We tend to deploy this information right about at the point where they've done, I at least do it, pretty much after they've done some of the structured input. They've encountered the text, we've done maybe 1 or 2 of the structured input activities, and then they're home, maybe finishing up the comprehension work and reading a little bit about the grammar at home. I tend to do this outside of class, although I like the fact that I have these visuals if I need to answer a question. Students don't always take in everything we've told them about in the grammar explanations, and it would be common to get a question about why it is chitayu but ya pishu the next day, and to have that, here you have an opportunity to use this visual to answer it. In class or out, mostly outside of class, I had a student tell me today that she is generally happy with the sequence. She likes the fact, she's a very deductive learner, she likes the fact that she can go to that grammar explanation anytime. She knows it's there, she knows where it is. So although I happen to assign it in a particular point, that doesn't mean students, we don't try to hide this information from students. It's there for them. What we do in class is focused on communication, active communication, understanding and use. But certainly students come in different varieties of learner, and we try to make the types of information available to all types of learners. Okay, we can go on. And notice that on the website, they actually have a moment where we do basically checking concept. Did you understand what verb conjugation was? Here is an audio activity where this duplicates a kind of activity that they see in class sometimes. You hear the sentence, who is doing the action? We were careful to structure these so that there would be no ambiguity in the endings. So they wouldn't get asked in a second conjugation verb to choose, once we get to second conjugation, we would not ask them to choose between on ljubit and ani ljubit. But we might ask them to choose between on ljubit and ty ljubiš. So they have some self-correcting answers. We're going to pause again before we move on to the production activities and let you take some time to ask some questions. And we don't have a whole lot to go, but let's pause here for some questions. Anything so far? There we go. Could we please comment on the ordering of homework activities? Would you recommend students first to read and then to listen? Okay. And the other question is, how much time would what you have shown take? Okay, those are both good questions. The ordering of homework activities. The homework activities are structured in a similar kind of way to the classroom activities, except they are oriented towards individual work and writing, listening and writing and reading, rather than spoken interaction. But they follow a similar kind of path where we start with asking students to look back at that first text. The first thing they do is they will have read the grammar and looked at the ya forms. And then they actually have to write ya sentence versions of the things on the first page of the verb presentation. But we tend to follow that same kind of stepwise form, mixing together and alternating between listening activities, reading activities. Bill, do you want to add anything about the homework sequence?
No, I think that's good. In terms of how much time it would take, what we've shown here, assuming that they're reading the explanations at home, the activities for in-class, those are about 2 hours, I would say.
Yeah.
Right? 2 days of in-class work.
Yeah. I think also, Svetlana, I want to make sure I understand your question. When you say reading and listening, I'm assuming you're meaning, do you mean for the text itself or for the grammar explanations? For the text itself, we actually want students to do both of these things at the same time. For the texts, we want you to stare at the text and hear the text multiple times. And we want you to do that because we want you to map the graphic symbols to a set of sounds. And, you know, Tonya отдыхает is not pronounced the way it's spelled, to put it mildly, right? Tonya отдыхает is not what we want students to hear. That's not what they're going to hear. So we do want them to listen and look all the time and to do both. I also tell students, download those SoundCloud things, put them on your phone, and walk around campus enjoying them. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that either. But they do need that moment where they are, and I often tell students, watch your students' eyes when they're looking at text, even in classroom activities, because they pick up their eyes well before they get to the end of any word. And it handicaps them in reading and getting grammatical information in an inflected language where a lot of the information is at the end of the word. So I often consciously tell students, I saw your eyes come up, glue them to the page and read that word again. And when they do that, they will suddenly pronounce the word correctly. So that's something to notice.
We also have a question here about when do you introduce infinitives?
Yes.
Well, once again, we introduce infinitives when the input allows us to have infinitives. So shortly after the presentation of first conjugation verbs, they do encounter second conjugation verbs, including lubits. And that's a perfect moment to actually have lubits plus infinitives. And then suddenly infinitives have some way of being used. They aren't a form that just sits in a grammatical table because we, by tradition, have put infinitives at the top of tables of verb conjugation. So we do postpone it a little bit. It's not postponed an incredibly long bit.
No, it's a matter of at most 5 days, I would say. 5 to 7 days. And depending on Unit 3, where there's a lot of stuff going on in this unit, but the whole chapter, this part of the chapter probably takes about 5 to 6 days, I would guess. This plus the part that includes the accusative case, really, is what we're talking about. There's a question, how many students do you use this with and what level are they at? This is introductory college level learners for us, although we know of some places where it is being used partially or wholly, partially, I think mostly in high schools as well. They are introductory learners who have not experienced the language before. This occurs in my program at about we have 65 hours in a semester. We're about at hour 20-something when we start the verbs. So we're maybe at about hour 28 out of 65 when we encounter the first verbs.
In the Portland State program, it might be a little later, around kind of probably 35 hours of contact when they first encounter this beginning part of Chapter 3. And once again, we've had everything of a class as small as 7 to his class as large as 26. The paired work, because of the visual way you can tell whether people are actually doing the assignment, does let you actually kind of keep an eye on who's doing things and who's not.
Okay, we have 3 more questions. Людмила Климанова has written in chat, so I'm going to read it off of chat. Если это первое представление глаголов, когда вводится и объясняется винительный падеж? В мини-текстах он встречается и даже в сопровождении прилагательного. Или это остается на интуитивное схватывание? Я бы сказала так, это не остается совсем на интуитивное схватывание, как вот значение слова. Нет, мы хотим, конечно, понять, чтобы они поняли лексическое значение данного слова. И все задания, которые они выполняют и вот как на уроке, так и дома, направлены именно вот туда, чтобы они показали, чтобы они поняли значение этих слов. Мы, конечно, вводим, или, можно сказать, просто студенты видят, и вот мы немного затруднились, когда пытались думать, как сказать на русском языке input, но когда видят вот этом языке, который они видят в начале главы, мы хотели показать не только глаголы, мы хотели показать полные предложения. Мы хотели, чтобы студенты увидели, столкнулись с полными предложениями, которые они могли понять, и смысл которых они могли понять. И поэтому мы просто добавили дополнение. Но они встречаются, вот винительный падеж вводится примерно через 2 дня, 3 дня после того, как они впервые видят эти глаголы. То есть это следующий момент после того, что мы показываем сегодня. Не знаю, ответила ли на этот вопрос, но это тут нет, я бы не сказала, что это интуитивное схватывание. Просто это есть, они видят эти формы, но пока внимание обращаем на другое.
Да, я добавлю только, что очень часто, даже когда мы уже объяснили винительный падеж, мы видим, что студенты пишут, и когда они просто отвечают на какое-то задание, делают ошибки, да, не помнят, что слово после глагола, если это переходный глагол, должен быть в винительном падеже. Они не чувствуют прямое дополнение. И поэтому они не очень беспокоятся о том, что есть другие слова в этих предложениях, где они смотрят именно на глаголы, поскольку они понимают содержание этого предложения. И таким образом довольно спокойно относятся к этим упражнениям, и тем более, что они видели большое количество этих предложений, когда мы начинаем говорить: смотрите на дополнения, которые вы видели в течение последних 3 дней на занятиях. Это уже как-то включается лампочка у них над головами.
Да, наступает момент, когда мы просим их вот обращать на это внимание. И это они, да, действительно, музыку. То они слушают музыку, а словарная форма ведь музыка. И вот, то есть вот с этого мы как раз исходим. I'm going to switch back to English to answer a question that says, there has been a notion to, quote, neglect grammatical components of language learning and stress the ability to comprehend and communicate. So are you suggesting separating teaching grammar from teaching vocabulary? Is it okay to spend 1 teaching period on grammar only? And I'm going to deal with that question rather than your other question about scoring students' tests. So I think the activities here, which are what we do in class, are they working on grammar or are they working on vocabulary? Well, we see them as integrated. As you are working on the vocabulary, you're working on it first for global comprehension. But then you actually start, with all of this support, using the grammatical forms in a supported way, and the grammar is there. And the students, because they have to read aloud correctly, are having to use the grammatical forms, but they're using them in communication. But yes, we do work on vocabulary and comprehending vocabulary before we start moving more towards focus on the forms. Yes, because as the student who talked to me today realized, oh, if I know endings but don't have words to put them on, then that's a problem. And I was very glad that that particular lampochka went on over his head halfway through the semester. But it's, it is one of the questions. We need the words, and we need to know that students know the words. And let's see. So the question about what order we introduce the cases, yes, nominative is first. We do accusative next as direct object. And also in the context of играет во что, football, those two things happen at almost the same time. And then the next thing that happens is prepositional case, где они живут. And that is essentially the grammar of Unit 3. Those three things happen in that order.
It's getting to be 20 after 3. We do have just a couple of more slides to move us from the idea of working with input, having students notice grammar in input, to actually show you what we'd expect them to produce. And so I'd like to show those, and then we can come back in the remaining time to the questions that are still here. And certainly, Lynn and I think, would be happy to answer questions individually by email afterwards as well. So just to show you some of the activities that kind of come next in terms of output, right, where there's less structure. So I think probably day 3, there are these pictures the instructor gives a time limit. They have to come up with as many captions as they can. Each caption at least 2 words, at least a noun plus a verb, if not something more. And this gets them kind of working on producing the forms, based on that visual stimulus. And once again, because there is a picture, there's also some way of controlling whether they actually understand the words correctly. A second, more communicative version of this is they have to come up with questions for interviewing a prospective roommate. So they come up with yes/no questions. They work on their intonation. We've reminded them that it's going to be a thief form. And they exchange that with a partner. And then based on that exchange of information, they have to then think and make a decision. Is this going to be a good roommate or not? And why, right? So they do have this place where they have to write down some of the things that that good or bad roommate might do, what makes them compatible and what makes them non-compatible. So there's an information exchange activity that they're then taking a lot of the sentences that they've seen and maybe expanding outward.
Can I interrupt, Bill, just to say, to clarify, that they do an activity right before this that prepares them for it by getting them to put the frequency words часто and редко in a sort of a paired conversation activity. So they're not really, they're drawings precisely on the input that they've already experienced. We're not asking them to suddenly start asking, what time do you get up in the morning, or anything like that. They really are working with the input they've seen.
And then a little further along, right before we get to the place where there is a lot of focus on the accusative case, there is a small written homework assignment that kind of pulls together the verb conjugation part. It uses that very old-fashioned technique, translation, but a technique that's also very helpful. Because this is probably one of the first moments in their writing where they have to remember that Russian does not have auxiliary verbs. So the ты делаешь, гуляешь, right? The do you go strolling or walking, right? Is not a viable form in Russian. And you can see that it is a production activity, but it's a production activity that works over several sentences, so they're creating a mini conversation, and that they're using the kind of input that they have seen to produce output. And the final written activity that I would point to is one that's really at the end of the long arc of instruction of present tense verb conjugation plus direct objects. And so at the very conclusion of this, they have an activity where they have to develop questions to ask a Russian-speaking visitor to their class. They have to come up with 8 yes-no questions to ask about the interests. They're focusing on formal language because they don't know this visitor. And then they're given that sample, "Вы слушаете американскую музыку." So you can see how all the grammatical components now actually come together in the preparation for what could be a communicative activity of having these questions asked and answered in class the next day.
Okay. Okay, so the next is me. Okay, so we're going to take a moment just to sort of review what we did. We worked on one form meaning mapping at a time, and that means we started with only the third person forms. Second, we included both referential activities, and that was the activity where we said, which character is doing this? There is a verifiable set of information that answers that question. And affective activities, which is when they said, how often do I do this? Я читаю блоги. Часто, редко, я не читаю блоги. We, at all points, kept learners doing things with the input. They weren't having it just wash over them. They had to do specific kinds of activities, even at the point where they couldn't produce language. They're checking sentences that apply to them. They're categorizing or matching verbs to people who do them. And they're often doing this in pairs and reading aloud as they do it. We keep meaning in mind. We keep the lexical meaning in our sights all the time. Almost all the activities that we've been having them do are, in that sense, what we call meaning-based. Most of the time, students have had to understand the lexical meaning of the verbs just in order to do the activity. They can't do it purely mechanically or by rote. So, and we've done work in written and oral formats. We have audio input, we have visual input, and at all stages of the work, there has been listening, there has been reading, there has been speaking, and there has been writing. But yes, we've been working on grammar. You can go on to the next one. For output activities, what is our sort of our takeaway, our sum up? Lexical meaning is important there too. There is personalized content. This is the point at which we are changing from the language of the text to making that the student's language that they can use to talk about themselves and about others. Where it is possible, especially in classroom activities, there is this communication, this back and forth that the students have with each other, ideally with some kind of a gap in information. So they have to find out something from each other. And then often, sometimes where we can do it, we have a gap in information or reasoning or opinion, and the students have to find out information, not only find it out, but do something to retain it, record it, figure out what they're going to do with it to evaluate something. And an example of that we didn't show you right now would be to have students exchange information once they get играю football, for example, and they've been given a lot of input on that, to share that information among themselves and fill out a table deciding how to put students in groups based on what sports they're into. So they have to take in the information, they have to use the information, and they have to make a decision using that information. So they're using the language to accomplish something. Okay. So this takes us back to the striking a balance. Have we struck a balance? And Bill, I can't remember if this is you or me. I think it's
me. And I'm not sure that I have much to say about what's on the screen, right, other than what's on the screen, right? So we've organized instruction in a way to keep class time spent on communicative activities. The activities engage in making sure that learners have active comprehension over what they're saying. There's communicative use of the input. So they're taking chunks of that input, or they're taking pre-made language and using it to express their own meanings. But because we have pre-formed it, because we've provided that scaffolding in the input, they can do it with better grammatical control than if they go immediately from seeing it once to having to produce it without that scaffolding support. And they spend most of the time reading about the language outside of class.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a question from someone anonymously, do you ask the students to learn verb stems, a form that does not exist in the language? And the answer to that is no. We don't ask them to learn verb stems because they don't really exist in the language. We do use verb stem as a way of helping students decouple the infinitive, right, which is often unhelpful for putting endings in the present tense, particularly of first conjugation verbs. And so we want them to focus on something that is consistent in the conjugation of the verb in the present tense, which is probably more frequent in their language use than an infinitive ending or an infinitive stem. And so that's the explanation behind it, and it allows us to actually have them see that there's greater regularity to Russian verb endings than what might immediately be apparent.
Yeah.
And the question of whether, what is it that gets stored in the student's memory as what means read? I'm not even going to take a stab at that, right? There's way too much psycholinguistic material out there, and that's a really hard question to answer.
Mm-hmm. So are we moved on to answering questions now?
I think so.
Okay, so I'm going to, at this point, people are putting in questions on both chat and the Q&A. I'm going to, Людмила Климанова asked, то есть вы не просите студентов самостоятельно воспроизводить материал, использование языка пассивное, no output. Я думаю, что мы ответили уже на этот вопрос. Если нет, то можно повторить. Но, конечно, мы переходим, в течение этого процесса мы переходим к более активному использованию материала. Я думаю, что мы сейчас это уже показали. My students just confessed today, here's a question, that they have no idea what an indirect or direct object are. How do I model direct and indirect objects for them in a way that they can grasp the grammar intuitively? I think I would say that for us at least, the presentation of indirect objects and direct objects are nowhere near each other in terms of where they occur in our input. And we were very careful. The indirect object concept, they don't even really see it at the same time. We concentrated on direct objects at first, although when students asked in class, there was a question, there was the example of I am reading a book, and I'm reading a book to my little brother, and one of these was a direct object. And, you know, but it is the input that really is going to model for them. We're going to try to get them to understand what a direct object is, and some students are going to be better at that than others. But all students can take in and learn as communication and use in communication. Я читаю статью и пишу конспект, я слушаю музыку, я не отдыхаю в парке, я отдыхаю дома, я слушаю рок, я слушаю рэп. So students can take in that material, and when they have when they have enough input, it's easier to help them understand what a direct object is, because they are confronted with a lot of positive evidence about how the language works. And it's very hard for us to talk to them about those concepts when they don't have enough evidence. So that's why seeing and using 40 sentences at the beginning is really good evidence of how verb conjugation works. And the same thing happens when we teach the accusative case. And that the trajectory from they first see я слушаю музыку on day 1 of the unit, but it is really about day 8 or 9 when we are starting to ask them to produce accusative forms in a larger way independently. And between those two dates, they are doing activities like the ones you saw with verbs, where there is constant input, the barrage of input coming at them. where, there are separate activities for что вы слушаете, что вы, then once they learn изучаете, что вы изучаете, and we come back to it over and over. In each new lexical context, the grammatical context reappears as well. So I hope I've answered that question. Bill, you want to tackle another one? So, let's see. На каком языке вы даете падежные окончания прилагательных?
Well, ну, я попробую ответить на этот вопрос, когда вводим окончание прилагательных. Мы вообще вводим окончание прилагательных почти сразу после окончания существительных для данного падежа. Но мы понимаем, что умение студентов, особенно на первом курсе, схватывать и окончание прилагательных, и окончание существительных одновременно, это трудно им. Просто им не дается всегда это осуществить. И поэтому прилагательные, скорее всего, такие формы, которые вводятся вот в языковом материале, то есть в input, но не особенно стараемся, чтобы они это воспроизводили ну, в таком открытом плавании после введения темы. Ну, они могут, конечно, если это очень хорошо знакомая фраза, но мы думаем, что как-то просто нереально ожидать, что студенты будут осваивать эти формы одновременно с формами существительных.
I think there's a question that will sort of get us, bring us to a conclusion. How is the textbook structured? How do you introduce phonetics in writing? Is it possible to see more pages? I think this is the point at which we're going to say that in conclusion, because we do need to wrap up soon, I think, that you're going to have access to a handout. The handout, in addition to having you'll see the PowerPoint, but you will also see a handout that you can download that will contain both the principles of creating these activities and a lot of links to междунами.org, specific pages in междунами.org, which is where the textbook lives. And you can see as many pages as you want because it's open access. And there's information there that you can look at and you can deploy in any way you choose. It really is for you. You can read about how we use it in our first year classes, and we also explain there how phonetics in writing are introduced, and we are happy to answer any questions you have. I think we were a little shy of making this in any way feel like advertising, but we're certainly happy to help you understand how it works if you want to contact us about it. And yes, it is open access, and anyone who wants to, as with any textbook, you can adopt it if you would like to. I think that's all I have to say. I was very happy to have this opportunity. It's wonderful to have been able to talk to so many of you.
Yes, it's been fabulous to actually have the chance to kind of share the thinking about grammar and how to actually structure some of these very difficult topics that we all teach and deal with regularly. So thank you for the opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, everyone, for participating, for joining us today. I hope it's not going to be the last time we see you guys.
I hope so too.
All right. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
До свидания.
До свидания.
До свидания.